Welcome, everybody. It is, I want to not screw up Jonathan's thing here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Cohen, the Robert Benheim and Lynn Benheim Thoman Professor of Neuroscience at Princeton University, as one of the 2018 APS William James Fellows. Indeed, it means a great deal to me personally to give this introduction, as I had the privilege and honor of working with Jonathan early in my career as a postdoctoral fellow. And I can say without reservation that it was transformative, both professionally and personally. And when I say personally, I really mean it, because it was while I was working in Jonathan's lab that I met and eventually married my husband, Todd Braver, who was a graduate student of Jonathan's. Todd was disappointed not to be able to be here to help deliver this introduction, but he helped me write it, and the words reflect our joint sentiments. Jonathan has been a seminal and guiding figure in cognitive psychology and neuroscience since the beginning of his career. A career that has been thoroughly interdisciplinary in nature before that was a buzzword in our field. In his earliest work, he introduced a series of computational models that address the role of cognitive control mechanisms that enable selective attention processes in classic tasks like the Stroop. And at the same time, he was generating important and innovative theories regarding the role of the prefrontal cortex and neurotransmitters such as dopamine and norepinephrine in higher cognitive functions. Even further, the models suggested experimentally testable hypotheses regarding the nature of cognitive dysfunction in psychopathology, specifically schizophrenia. This work remains one of the most influential and highly cited applications of neural network models, not only to cognitive psychology, but also to basic and clinical cognitive neuroscience. Indeed, this framework has stood the test of time in helping us to understand core brain behavior relationships. His contributions to understanding the nature of information processing deficits in neuropsychiatric disorders has been equally generative and long-lasting, helping to spawn a new subfield that has become known as computational psychiatry. Now, if the work I just described were Jonathan's only contributions to psychological science, it would be more than enough to justify his being awarded the William James Fellow. However, on the side, he also helped to develop the methodological foundations for contemporary functional task MRI research, using the emerging technology to help study the brain bases of the functions that he was modeling computationally. And he conducted some of the first and most elegant studies to probe the activity and dynamics of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, along with numerous other brain regions, including the anterior cingulate cortex. A very consistent theme throughout Jonathan's research has been this balanced emphasis on cognitive, computational, and neuroscientific perspectives. And this powerful triple focus has become a template for many outstanding researchers who have joined the field subsequently. Indeed, Jonathan has trained many of these researchers, serving both as a revered mentor and an architect of large-scale training programs at Carnegie Mellon, the University of Pittsburgh, and now Princeton University for the last 2 decades. The list of investigators that Jonathan has mentored is long and storied and include many individuals who have impacted the field themselves, and the list is really too long to read here. Not surprisingly, this is not the only award that Jonathan has received, but I also don't have time to list all of those. But I will say that I think Jonathan most fully exemplifies the namesake of the William James APS Fellow Award, not only for his lifetime of significant intellectual contributions to the science of psychology across many different domains, but in terms of the breadth and scope, depth, and creative nature of the research that he's conducted, and which we're going to get to hear about today. So please join me in congratulating Jonathan Cohen on the William James Fellow Award.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Deanna, and it means as much, if not more, to me that you were the one to introduce me. I think it sort of stands as an emblematic point that science is, as so many people have so often said, not something, at least usually, done alone, and certainly not in my case. So I want to start by acknowledging all the incredible people that have trained me, whether directly or indirectly through their own work that I've admired and tried to emulate, including the people here, and in particular, Jay McClelland, who not only trained me, but helped create the field in which I work. So I owe him a particular debt of gratitude. I also want to thank the people not only on whose shoulders I've stood, but who I've stood shoulder to shoulder with, And there's a long list of these people, but I want to call out the person at the bottom of the list, Lee Nystrom, who was actually a graduate student of Jay's as well, and soon after he graduated, teamed up with me, joined my lab, and has helped me run it ever since. And though he's not always on all the papers these days, he's helped carry a major administrative burden. I would not have the career I have had if it weren't for Lee sort of, at my side, covering my back, and getting all the work that needs to be done to do the kinds of program building that I've been fortunate enough to participate in. So I really want to thank Lee. And then finally, I want to thank all the incredible graduate students, postdocs, undergraduates who I don't have room to list here, that I'd say I lent a shoulder to, but in point of fact, just as often, they were lending me theirs. So it's really an incredible privilege to have worked with these people, and I really want to thank them for that. Okay, so I'm here to talk about work that I've been engaged in for, I hesitate to say, 3 decades. And the focus of that has been on cognitive control. Now, I'm guessing that most of you in this room know what that means, but there may be some at least who don't and are intrigued by the term. So here's at least a broad definition: the ability to guide behavior in accord with internally represented goals or intentions, and in particular, when that involves overcoming otherwise compelling response tendencies. So here's a simple example to sort of make that concrete. It's simple, but I think it's instructive. If I were to ask you, after having maybe tickled you with a feather or maybe noticing that you have a mosquito bite, to not scratch the itch, you may not listen to me, as I never did when my parents told me that, but you might. And if you did, and you did it as quickly as you're able, which would be within maybe a second, I say don't scratch, and then you're about to scratch, and you stop right then and there. That's what I mean when I talk about cognitive control, at least in its purest form. And it's remarkable for 2 reasons. First of all, it exhibits the incredible flexibility that we have to exercise this ability. With just 2 words, some deflections of particles in the air that hit your tympanic membrane, a few action potentials, a few synapses away, and within, on the order of a half second to a second, you can override something that is tremendously compelling and something that you may never have done before. But what's even more remarkable is that in doing that, you're overriding something like 200 to 300 million years of evolution. Because the tendency to want to scratch is something that was written into your DNA, literally your DNA, something like 200 or 300 million years ago. And the evidence for that is this. Every mammal we know of itches and scratches. Okay? I don't know if reptiles do. Birds do. So I don't know how far back it goes in reptiles. If it goes back to reptiles, then it's like 300 million years. If it's just mammals, it's 200 million years. But what's equally remarkable is that there's not a single one of these species that you could, with 2 words or 2 utterances in a second, get them not to do it. Yes, you might be able to train them in the laboratory for weeks or months or maybe even years to do that. But it would take that amount of time. Not a single one can be told like that not to do it. Now, you may say that that rests on language, and I would say sure, but language rests on cognitive control. In fact, the capacity for cognitive control seems uniquely developed in humans. It can be flexibly deployed in nearly arbitrary ways at a moment's notice, as I hope this example shows. And it's fundamental to virtually all of the characteristically human behaviors exhibited in the kinds of tasks that we so like to use. Reasoning, problem solving, planning, symbolic language, executive function, and the little icons on the right, you can use as a little test of whether you're a cognitive psychologist or not, because those should tell you exactly what tasks I mean, but I'll leave it to your imagination to figure that out. It also, I think, stands sort of as an intellectual foundation for understanding human behavior. The distinction between controlled and automatic processing is a cornerstone of psychological theory, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It's also an antecedent, and I would argue isomorphic, to distinctions that are fundamental in behavioral economics and have gained a tremendous amount of attention recently. Originally talked about as system 1 versus system 2 processes, or deliberative versus reflexive behavior, and maybe perhaps made most popular in Danny Kahneman's book when he writes about thinking fast and thinking slow. And I have it on direct authority from Danny himself that when he talks about thinking fast and thinking slow, he means nothing more than controlled versus automatic processing. And in fact, he was one of the, one of the original researchers in this area, though not listed on the next slide because I have him listed here, but was a pioneer in this area, and he's basically brought these ideas into the world of behavioral economics and economic theory. It's also closely related, I think, to distinctions in computer science, and had I had more time in this talk, I would talk about the relationship between what we've learned and what we're continuing to learn about cognitive control, including some of the work I'm going to talk about today, and notions in computer science, and in particular, modern machine learning. I don't, but I'll at least point out that this distinction is very similar to one that's maybe isomorphic also to one in computer science between interpreted and compiled procedures. So I think it's a fundamentally important idea. I just want to say a word about sort of its heritage. It's interesting, it began with a rather formal grounding, or the ideas about control began in rather formal notions, first attributed to James Maxwell, who was studying governors, that he referred to as devices that were that had feedback capable of self-regulation, self-adaptation and self-regulation. I think more commonly we think of control theory as being associated with Norbert Wiener, who coined the term cybernetics to mean the scientific study of control and communication in animals and machines. This was picked up by Miller, Pribram, and Galantner in a very influential book that they wrote called Plans in the Structure of Behavior, in which they proposed a model called the TOTE model, test, operate, test, and exit, that was essentially built on Norbert Wiener's ideas and was an attempt to begin to apply it to psychology. And it's not clear to me why this didn't catch on and why the study of control in humans didn't maintain its close association with the developments in engineering, which have continued over the past 3 decades, or actually half a century really, to mature. I don't know, maybe these pictures give a sense of why control theory seems so scary to people in psychology. Maybe it's because a kinder face was put on it, and associated with a more descriptive approach. And that was the work of Mike Posner in a treatise that he wrote with Snyder, paper by Posner and Snyder, that really can be credited as having been the first definition of cognitive control that's used in contemporary, that's still used in contemporary cognitive psychology. And that was paired very quickly by some empirical work by Schifrin and Schneider, who did this absolutely elegant, perhaps the most elegant series of experiments, at least in my view, done in cognitive psychology to establish the sort of operational characteristics of cognitive control. And so this sort of qualitative description of control, which I'll give you in just a moment, coupled with kind of empirical rigor that was used to test it, I think established the foundations for what became half a decade of research. And it had as its core a central tenet, which is that there is a central capacity-limited processing mechanism upon which control mechanisms rely, and that's what distinguishes them from automatic processes which don't rely on this. And this imposes, among other things, a seriality constraint, that only one control process can operate at a time. And it's not surprising that at least in the background, if not in many cases, in some cases rather explicitly, there was this notion that control was a lot like a CPU. This was sort of during the advent of the Von Neumann architecture and the success of symbolic processing in computer science. And so the idea was that maybe cognitive control relies on a CPU in the way that processing in a traditional computer relied on the CPU, the central processing unit. And this was operationalized literally paradigmatically in the Kuhnian sense, that is in terms of experimental procedures that define cognitive control in terms of dual task design. And the idea was that if you have a task that's already defined as control dependent and you try and perform another one at the same time, if one of the two suffers when you try and do them both at the same time, then the one you're trying to diagnose is determined to be control dependent, and if not, then it's not. This became a central tenet of cognitive theory, including mechanistic or computational models of psychological function, perhaps most famously and most influentially the ACT-R model developed by John Anderson, initially with Gordon Bauer, and later as ACT-STAR, and later developed into the ACT-R model that has been overwhelmingly influential, perhaps the most successful computational modeling endeavor in the history of psychology, and still stands as a formidable contributor to our understanding of psychological function. At its heart, at least initially, was the notion that you can only fire one production at a time that depended on some sort of central representation of the goal, the current goal in working memory. And then finally, as I said, empirical validation, beginning with Schifrin and Schneider, and later inspired by the work of Welford on the psychological refractory period, carried on by Hal Pashler, all of which seem to confirm the notion that there really is a central bottleneck that suggests the presence of a limited capacity processor. Recently, this has been taken up in sort of a return to more formal approaches, both in the work of my colleagues and myself, in particular Amitai Shenhav and Matt Botvinnik, in a theory that we proposed a few years ago, initially to explain functions of anterior cingulate cortex, but now that's been developed into a broader theory of cognitive control that we refer to as the expected value of control theory, paralleled by work in Tom Griffith's lab, in particular with a graduate student, Falk Leiter, on what they refer to as rational meta-reasoning. And these both sort of build on the notion that control is a mechanism for optimizing a cost-benefit analysis and allocating control to those behaviors that are most remunerative. And the cost is commonly assumed to be an opportunity cost, very much along the lines that Rob Kurzban and others suggested a few years ago. And so the idea is that if you can only do one thing at a time, then you want to choose the one that provides the best returns. And this basically suggests a notion of bounded rationality. That is, the purpose of control is to optimize in the face of limited capacity. You can only do one thing, so pick the thing that you can, that's most valuable to you. But, and this is the pivot point of the talk, this doesn't explain the limitation itself. It supposes there's a limitation, but it doesn't explain it. Now, one explanation could be the CPU. I don't think that's right, and the purpose of this talk is to challenge that notion. Okay? But before I get there, let me offer a few other kinds of explanations that are commonly provided. Perhaps the most famous one is that there's a metabolic constraint on cognitive control. The other main class is structural, and I guess I would put the CPU hypothesis in that category. I often talk about this in stronger terms. I'll try and be more respectful in this austere venue. And I'll say these explanations seem unlikely. Metabolic? Well, the back of the brain does what now we have come to refer to as deep learning, or exercising when it's acquired through deep learning, that, at least in Google's hands, takes gigawatts of electricity, hundreds of thousands of processors, all in a tenth of a second, meaning 10 times a second, and not just 16 hours a day that you're awake, but at night, because we dream in Technicolor. It's doing visual information processing, object recognition, attentional selection all the time. It's doing it as you're looking at me, and as I said, even in your dreams. So if it was so metabolically costly, this would seem to be a lot more expensive than doing two-digit arithmetic. If I ask you to do two-digit arithmetic problems in your head, you can't do it. Is that really more expensive than recognizing a face? Right? And yet it seems rather valuable. So why would the decision have been to put so much effort into that is visual computation? Obviously, that's valuable too, but basically nothing into two-digit arithmetic. My watch can do two-digit arithmetic problems at the same time if I ask it to. Right? So, well, maybe not my watch, but certainly my computer. So it just seems unlikely. Similarly, structural constraints. And here again, I would put the CPU hypothesis in this category. We think the frontal cortex is one of the key structures. It's not the only one, but one of the key structures, perhaps the key structure in implementing the human capacity for cognitive control. It's certainly one of the parts of the brain that's most expanded in humans and has been consistently linked with capacity for cognitive control. It comprises about 30% of the neocortex, which means it has, if the neocortex has 100 billion neurons, it has about 30 billion neurons, and it can only do one thing at a time. Now, if evolution wasn't a good enough engineer to figure out how to do, allocate metabolism, that would have been bad. But this is even more ridiculous. 30 billion cores, and you can't do two-digit arithmetic problems at the same time? That just doesn't seem right. Evolution is not as sort of, incremental as it is, that just doesn't seem like the solution it could have come to. So I submit that there is a better and more rational account. I would say a computational account. An explanation for why it is that we only are able to do one or a small number of control-dependent things at once. And the inspiration for this idea harkens back to an idea that was actually proposed not long after the notion of a central limited capacity processor was first proposed. And this was sort of a counter-proposal led by Alan Allport and Navan and Gopher, which they referred to as the multiple resources view, and it was discussed in the context of attention, but really it's a theory of control, or an idea about control, I would argue. And followed up by others, including Meyer and Kiris in a computational modeling in the mid-1990s. And the notion here is that the constraints on processing don't reflect a constraint on the central controller, but rather on local resources. And a classic illustration of this that I think was in part the inspiration for this idea was conducted by Schaefer in the mid-70s, in which he asked people to do two pairs of tasks, two multitasking conditions. In one, he asked them to conduct echoing or shadowing, which was a very common practice for studying attention at the time, where you listen to words presented in a headphone and then have to do something. In this case, subjects were simply asked to say out loud the words they were hearing while they were copying text that appeared on a page. Okay? So that was one multitasking condition. And the other was, it was contrasted against another one in which subjects were asked to take dictation. So now they would listen to the words, but instead of saying them, they would have to type them, and then they would have to read out loud the words that were on the page. Now right there you might note that reading out loud is, many of you know anyway, is considered to be the canonical automatic process, at least acquired automatic process. And yet what they observed is that people with a little bit of training could do the first task or pair of tasks. They could multitask echoing and copy typing, but they couldn't do the second. And so it looks something like this if you were to diagram it. For the echoing and copy typing task, echoing, you get an auditory input, and you've got to encode that into phonologic representations that you can then use to generate the verbal output. Right? And for copy typing, the input is visual, so you have to encode that orthographically to recognize what the words are, and then you use that to generate a manual output. Okay? So these are parallel streams, no problem. But what happens when you ask people to do dictation and reading? Well, now you've got a situation like this. For dictation, you still have to encode the information auditorily, but now, having encoded it phonologically, you've got to translate it into an orthographic code to generate a manual response. And conversely, for reading, you have to encode the input visually, orthographically, but translate it into phonologic code to generate a verbal response, and therein lies the problem. If you have to do both of these at once, and the word you hear is different than the word you're trying to type, then you have conflict, in this case, in both of these points, right? And the observation here that I think that's critical is that a problem arises in what Allport and others refer to as shared resource, sort of local resources, but what I'll call shared representations. That is, these representations are now being shared for two processes, right? And the supposition is that when you have a resource like this, set of representations, you can't activate two different representations in that pool at the same time. I'll give you a better example of that in just a moment. Okay, so here's the first thesis of this talk. Shared representations pose a risk of conflict. This is really just a restatement of the multiple resources hypothesis. Control serves to prevent such conflict. I think this was implicit in the multiple resources hypothesis. I'm going to make it explicit in form of a model in just a moment. And therefore, the argument is that constraints on processing is the purpose of control, not a limitation of it. So this inverts the standard interpretation. Instead of thinking of control as reflecting a bound on rational processing, that the limitation is attributable to control itself, rather, it reflects a rational response, a rational bound on processing, given that you have shared representations. So the next part of the talk is going to be to focus on that. And then the second part will address why would we have shared representations if it poses this problem. Okay, so here's a simple model that sort of concretizes the notion of how control can be used to resolve shared representations. And I'm going to start with a little demonstration the first of two. It's one that you will all recognize as familiar. In fact, you've already seen on a slide previously. I'm going to ask you to play along. I'm going to do it slightly differently than you're used to having it done. So try not to second guess. Just go ahead, and when I show you the next stimulus, respond out loud as quickly as possible. So the only instruction you have is respond out loud, but to do it immediately. Okay? Ready, set, go. Thank you. Nobody said red, even though you're all psychologists, or most of you are psychologists. You know what this is. Of course, it's the Stroop task, or a Stroop stimulus. And the reason I did it this way, rather than ask you to name the color, which of course you would have taken another 250 milliseconds to do, is to point out that you have a prepotent response. I didn't tell you what to do. You all did the same thing. Clearly, there is a strong prepotent tendency to read the word, right? And yet, so it's like scratching an itch. But if I were to ask you to name the color, as I would have in the laboratory, of course, you can do it, right? So extra 200 milliseconds, but you can do it, right? And so the question is, how does this happen? Well, so here's a model of sort of the standard state of affairs. And this is a model, first piece of work that I did working at the time. Actually, I wasn't even really working in Jay's lab. I was taking his course. This was done with Kevin Dunbar, who's shown in the middle there, as a class exercise. And I often point this out to my students, that class exercises can turn into careers, if you're lucky. So this is a model that we built to try and account for this. Kevin has spent his graduate career, he was a postdoc at the time, in Pittsburgh working with Dave Clark, and he had spent his graduate career working with Colin McLeod studying the Stroop effect, and so it seemed a natural thing for him to want to model it, and I wanted to be a modeler, and so we teamed up, and this is what we came up with. The idea is that there are input representations for the two different stimulus dimensions, colors and words, and you'll note that, and then they map to a verbal response. Right? And you'll notice that the strength of the connections is stronger in the word pathway to capture the idea that you've had more experience reading words and saying them out loud by the time at least you're an undergraduate in one of these experiments than you have naming colors. You spend a lot more time reading words than going, umami, mami, look, red fire truck, right? It's also more, in the terms of Schifrin and Schneider, more consistently mapped. When you see a word, you're more likely to think that its pronunciation and the phonologic response than all the possible things it might connote, unless you're asked to, as opposed to seeing a color, you don't necessarily think to say it. If you see the color, you might think embarrassment or fire, right? Or anger or whatever. So if this is the full model, then you'd have a hard time naming the color, because when I present a stimulus like this, the strength of this pathway is going to lead to a greater activation of the word green than the color red, and you'll say green. And setting aside possibility of a little bit of noise that might sometimes get you to say red, by and large, you'll do exactly what you did in this room. So this is a model of what happened in this room, but not what happens if I ask you to name the color. For that, we need to add another component, what we'll call control mechanism, or something that represents control signals, and those can be used to provide additional priming or sensitization of the units used to process the mapping from the color to the response, so that it can overcome this otherwise stronger response tendency. And that provides sort of a simple, basic model of how control might work. And as and it's basically formed the foundation for 3 decades of work on thinking about how this might be implemented in the brain, how we might refine it, and how all the kinds of questions that it poses can be answered. For example, how do you get those representations? How do you know when to activate them? None of which I'm going to talk about today. But I use it here to point out that in this case, what this says, among, I think, many other things, is that the purpose of control is to manage the crosstalk that's occurring here. So here's a case where you have a set of representations that are shared for two purposes, naming colors and reading words, and you can't do both at the same time, or you do things like, say, gred or reen, and you don't want to do that. And so as a consequence, you need something like this to manage the inputs so that this thing is only used for one purpose at a time. So that's sort of the fundamental thesis of what control is for, okay? And now, this is a problem that arises only at the output level. So you may say, oh, it's only a problem because we have one mouth, right? Or maybe if you're dealing with where you're going to point your finger, it's only one finger. But it's not just at the output level that we have this problem. So I want to just give you a few tasks or add a task that you might imagine doing, and we'll actually go and do later, that point out that the sharing can happen at earlier stages and cause the same kind of problem. Okay? So imagine now, instead of asking you to say the word, I simply ask you to point left when you see the word red and point right when you see the word green. Okay? So I have to have some sort of representation here that activates the word representation, and maybe I'm not showing it, but something that activates the manual response representation. And as we'll see shortly, it's not hard for you to be able to do that. Okay? But the problem is that even though you can learn to do that quickly by using these representations that you have for words here to map them to a new response, okay, if you do it that way, you're going to have trouble if you try and do color naming at the same time. Now, that may not be something that you do every day, but if I ask you to do it, you're going to have a hard time, and we'll see that that's exactly true. And the reason is because these representations are shared, right? And so if I activate these and this at the same time that I activate this and this, I've opened up this pathway that's now caused me trouble for this. So even though I'm not asking you to do this, if I engage these representations for this purpose, and at the same time I engage some output that they're connected to for some other purpose, I've opened up a new pathway that causes trouble. Okay? And control is there to solve that problem and effectively tell me, don't try and do these two things at once or you're going to get in trouble. Okay? So shared representations leads to crosstalk, even when they occur earlier in the system. Okay? And we'll argue that this happens, in fact, later in the talk. But what this does is sort of there is a solution, which is to develop separated representations, that is, dedicated representations for this word pointing task, right? And then there wouldn't be crosstalk here. And as I said, in the second part of the talk, we'll talk about what the relationship is between these two possibilities and why it's so commonly the case that we do this and therefore that we need control. So let me just pause and give you sort of an intuitive sense of what this story tells so far. Imagine you're building a town. You're a town planner, and you're going to build a brickyard that you want to get bricks to the construction site, and maybe you're going to build a printing press because you want books for your library or for your school. And so you build the brickyard where there are where there's places that you can mine whatever the clay is you need for the bricks, and you put the printing press where it's convenient to get the materials for printing. And then you'll build some transit system that will carry the products to their destinations. And as long as those are separated, that is, the bricks are on one side of the town, on the same side of town as the construction site, and the printing press is on the other side of town, and as the library or the school, then that transit system has no problem. The vehicles can go back and forth delivering the loads. But the town prospers, you want to expand it, you want a new construction site on the other side of the library from the initial construction site. Now you've got a problem, right? You could build another brickyard, but that seems silly, right? It might not even be possible. And so what makes sense, of course, is to build a pathway, a thoroughfare from the brickyard, the original brickyard, to the new construction site. But if that crosses the thoroughfare from the printing press to the library, the school, you're going to have to deal with the crossing. And one way of dealing with it is to simply build overpasses. And that way all the vehicles can sort of go about their business. But these are expensive to build, and they can get rather complicated. And if you don't believe me, just consult your town council and the number of times that discussions have been had about the nearby, in this area it would be El Camino Real, where I live it's Route 1, sort of the main commercial district where there's a lot of traffic going along it, but then there's a lot of intersections and there's this tension between getting cars across it, but keeping the main venue going. And at least where I live on Route 1, they, not so long after I moved to Princeton, decided to build an overpass to replace one of the lights for just this reason. And it took, of course, twice as long as they proposed, 4 or 5 years. It held up traffic for years, and there's never been one built since in the 20 years that I've been there. Right? These things are expensive to build. They're valuable, but they're expensive. Of course, there's, therefore, the easier alternative, which is to simply build an intersection and put some lights there. Right? This solves the problem because it's cheap, it happens quickly. It's also in some ways more flexible because now cars can go in any direction. When you build overpasses, if you don't build sort of complicated ones like that, then cars can only sort of go over and under, but they can't make the turns. And to make the turns, it's even more costly, whereas an intersection sort of serves all the purposes, but they carry a risk, which of course is this. Right? They need to be managed. And so how do we manage them? We put up lights. And so now this poses the question, how do the crossings affect the flow of traffic Or put another way, if I have a bunch of crossings, how many lights can I put that are green? How many lights can I let be green at the same time? Obviously, I can't make them all green, or there'd be no point in having them, right? So there's a certain number of lights that can be green that will maximize the amount of traffic without the risk of there being collisions, right? So this is an engineering problem. You'd think that this would have been solved mathematically, and to the best of my ability over the course of the last 7 years to find it, there's been no such formal theoretical analysis of this problem. And when we first began to ask it, for the reasons that I hope you see, in terms of its relevance to what I think is going on in the brain, we looked for other solutions and couldn't find them, and so we set about trying to answer that question ourselves. Now, to be fair, there were models. So the question is, how do crossings affect traffic flow? Right? Now, to be fair, there have been models of this within the psychological domain. In fact, models based on systems like ACT-R that look at scheduling constraints required to avoid crosstalk, work, as I mentioned earlier, by Meyer and Kiris, and more recently by Salvucci and Takran, both using production system models, trying to implement in computational form the multiple resources idea that the problems in parallel processing arise from bottlenecks in local resources rather than a constraint on the central controller. So in the case of Meyer and Kiris, it was actually a production system that could fire many productions in parallel, but only when it wouldn't cause trouble. And these have done a really good job of explaining the performance characteristics of people, and including some of the phenomena that have been used to justify the hypothesis of a centralized controller, but explaining it rather in terms of local bottlenecks. So, for example, explaining phenomena like the psychological refractory period. But they assume a pre-specified architecture. That is, they say, OK, given these bottlenecks, how many things can we do at once? They don't address two critical questions, which is, how does the number of crossings, or the frequency of sharing of representations in psychological terms, affect the overall parallel processing capacity of the system, or the demands for control? And how does that scale with network size? Right? So one intuition you might have is that if a network gets really, really big, then the problem of crossings becomes proportionately less of an issue. Okay? We'll address that in just a moment. But there's even more fundamental question. I've sort of hinted at it already, but it hasn't really been addressed in psychological terms, which is, why does the sharing occur at all? Why do the crossings occur at all? Yeah, it's expensive on Route 1 to build an overpass. Why is it so expensive in the brain? Is it expensive? Okay? So we'll come back to that later. First, I want to address this question, which is how the parallel processing capacity of a system scales with the number of crossings. As I said, you might imagine that it's proportionate. So if you have 100 pathways and maybe 10% of crossings, then, I don't know, just to pick some numbers, you can do 10 things at once. But if you had 1,000 pathways or processes and 10%, then you can do 100 things at once, right? And we were sort of intrigued by whether or not that might be true. And so we turned to modeling. And in this case, we found that connectionist modeling actually could help us answer this. Right, so this is the intuition. I think I'm a little ahead of myself, by doing some simulation analyses and ultimately mathematical analyses. And I'll just tell you the answer right now, and then I'll give you the data, is that it scales badly. Much worse than you possibly could have imagined. Okay? Even modest amounts of pathway overlap or sharing dramatically limit the number of things that can be done at the same time. And so, as I said, we pursued this both in numerical analysis by constructing simulations, but because simulations make a lot of assumptions and they don't necessarily generalize, and after having looked in the literatures of network scheduling, traffic scheduling, genetic cascade scheduling, no other field, all of which face this problem, seems to have come up with a formal theory for this. We decided to try and construct it on our own. And I've been lucky to work with mathematicians, in particular graph theorists and control theorists, who got interested in this. And we have some interesting results that I'll quickly summarize from those as well, generalizing the findings that we first started to see in the numerical analyses. So let me just start by quickly presenting the numerical analysis. And I won't go through any of the details. Mainly, I just want to sort of give you a sense of how we got about it and then show you the results. This is work done by a couple of postdocs and a graduate student in the lab at the time. Basically, the idea was we would construct networks that had multiple parallel processes like these. And we did it in various forms. We did it in very simple forms that could be analyzed at least in small scale, though not at larger scale, using sort of linear algebra. But we were interested in more dynamical models that don't have simple closed-form solutions. So we implemented things like drift diffusion processes, where each of these is a two-alternative force choice. And we picked in particular the drift diffusion model because we knew how to optimize the individual processes for any conditions under which it operates. And that's a line of work that I don't have time to go into. But the point is that it allowed us to do complete or dense optimization. So no matter what we subjected this network to, we could optimize the parameters of each of these processes to maximize some objective function like reward rate. Okay? And we could then ask, what's the maximum reward that this system can achieve, allowing it to run as many processes as it wants. So we gave it the opportunity to control each of these, and we asked, how many of these should it run at the same time in order to optimize the aggregate reward, assuming that it gets rewarded for everything that it does at the same time. Okay? And in this configuration, obviously, the optimal thing to do is to do all 5 of them, right? You get 5 times as much reward as compared to doing just one. But what we're interested in is what happens when we introduce crosstalk or cross pathways that might not be useful right now, but are present in the system perhaps for other purposes. And so we varied that both, by turning up the amount of crosstalk. Here's sort of modest amounts, here's even more. And we asked, under each of these conditions, what's the optimal number of processes to do at once, right? On the assumption that the cross connections were going to, on average, interfere. And again, that's an assumption that we can talk about and that we can address, that we've actually gone back and addressed in mathematical work. But the bottom line is you can take this, optimize it for any given amount of crosstalk, optimize the control policy to provide as much, to maximize the reward rate for any given pass, and then ask what's the optimal control policy. And so here are the results. They're striking. Okay? This is a plot of, along the x-axis, the amount of pathway overlap, so sort of what I showed you, increasing amounts of crosstalk, or potential for crosstalk, crossings, if you will. And then on the y-axis is the optimal number of processes that the system chooses to do to maximize reward rate. And the different colored lines are different size networks, from 20 to 40 to 100. And then at the time, the amount of time it took to run 1,000 was like 3 weeks. And so at that point, this was several years ago now, we'll probably go back and do this and do it more quickly and perhaps fill out that line. But we only had time to run one simulation with 1,000. But it makes the point, right? Once you get to about 20% overlap, which is not a huge amount, in this particular configuration, it doesn't matter how big the network is. There's a fixed size, not a proportional size. There's a fixed number of maximum processes that it can do, on the order of 10 to 15. Okay? So whether it's a network of 60 or 1,000, or by extension, 1 million or 100 billion, it can really only do about 10 to 15 things at once in order to maximize reward. Otherwise, it starts paying a cost. Okay? And this was striking and convinced us that this notion that the constraints on the human capacity for control might have, in fact, even in a system as big as the brain, assuming something like 20% convergence, might at least provide a qualitative kind of account. Now, that 20% number looks magic here, and well, it might be, although it seems to be, as I say, being borne out in mathematical analyses. But we were sort of curious, and I don't want to put too much stock on this, but it's hard not to report it. We were curious to know, well, what's going on in the brain? What's the convergence rate in the brain? And around that time, the Connectomics project had begun to flourish. This is a project run by Olaf Sporns at Indiana University in collaboration with people like David Van Essen at Washington University, collecting thousands and thousands of MRI scans and applying graph theoretic analyses to patterns of activity that observed, asking how many hubs there are and what's the density of the connections between them. And when you look at there were actually 3 papers that reported, technically referred to as the out degree of the graphs, but roughly comparable to degree of pathway overlap. And the number is somewhere between 10 and 20% convergence. So this number isn't actually crazy, or it doesn't sound like it's crazy. Okay, so that sort of provides some numerical results. And I don't have time to go into the, sorry, I want to say one thing. This was done under really restrictive assumptions that made analysis possible. Here's a list of them. I won't go through them. But every one of them, if you were to relax it, you can make a strong argument, will make the situation worse and possibly bring the number down to perhaps single digits or maybe even 1 or 2 things at a time. And then there are statistical arguments, which again, I don't have time to make. But if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to do it offline, that can convince you that in a situation like this, you really should only have 1 green light at a time. Okay, so I think that these sorts of analyses can bring us to the point where it makes sense that on average you can only expect to do one control-dependent thing at a time. Okay, and just to sort of back that up, and I am running a little bit short, so I don't think I'll go through this, but as I've said, we've now gone back and tried to commit these ideas to sort of more rigorous mathematical analysis using graph theory, where you can represent the network itself as a bipartite graph and then extract from that an interference graph and then do fancy things in graph theory called computing matches and induced matches, and from that computing the maximum independent set. This is for anybody who has any interest in these sorts of things. Everybody else can ignore it. The bottom line is that you get pictures that look pretty much the same. Right? So even under sort of relaxing the assumptions of the simulation work and asking in principle what's possible, it looks pretty similar. So, I'm going to have to skip this too. I'll just say quickly that these tools turn out to have a potential use in analyzing human brain imaging data. If you assume that the patterns of activity we see in the brain give us an index of what patterns are needed to perform a task, we can use these graph theoretic measures to measure patterns of activity in single tasks, and from that predict the multitasking profile of a person, assuming that the fMRI data is reliable enough. And this has potential incredible utility, because if you ask in a system where there's just maybe 10 input domains and 10 output domains, so maybe 100 possible tasks, mapping from one sort of input stimulus, like the size of something, to one particular response, maybe a reaching movement. In a space of 10 inputs by 10 outputs, there's 100 possible tasks you can configure, but 47 million multitasking possibilities. So if you wanted to know what the multitasking capabilities of a person were in that space, there's no way you could ever find it out behaviorally. But this suggests that with fMRI, and yes, with 100 scans, still a finite number, you could diagnose the multitasking capability of somebody in a fairly large space. And this is the kind of thing that, for example, you can imagine using for pilots, where there they have maybe 30 instruments, 150 instruments and 30 widgets or dials and levers that they've got to pull. And the space of possible multitask there is infinite. I mean, literally, it's not a number you can calculate on your calculator. But in principle, if we were to put people in the scanner, we could map out a huge part of that space and perhaps provide instructions on how to train pilots who, of course, rely heavily on the ability to multitask the information they're seeing on the displays and know what to, what widgets to pull and push and whatever, twist. Okay, so I need to skip that, and I have a little button here to do that. Sorry. It didn't skip it. Oh, that didn't work. All right, well, here's the example I was going to show you. Right. All right. So this leads me to sort of the last part, which is why, given this stultifying constraint that shared representations places on the capacity for sort of multitasking performance and the presumed value of multitasking performance, should we have shared representations? And the argument is that these are more efficient, can be learned faster, and are more flexible, and therefore there's a bias in learning to develop them. They're the rage in deep learning. If you go to NIPS, that's all you hear about, how you can build a network that extracts shared representations for the purposes of generalization. And they're the rage in people, too. And to make that point, I'm going to show you that they're in you. So let's just do a second demonstration. And for this, we're going to do that. First we're going to do a simple multitask. Okay? I'm going to put up a Stroop stimulus on the screen. I want you to name the color this time, so do the standard Stroop task. But it's going to appear on one side of the screen or the other, and I just want you to point to where you see it. Okay, so when you see the stimulus, you just point in that direction and say the color at the same time. Okay, so you think this is going to be easy or hard? Easy. Good. Ready, set, go. Most people said red. I heard a blue or two. I bet you'll get it right the second time. Very good. I didn't hear any yellows. Okay, so you just did a multitask, right? Out of the box. No problem. Okay, now I'm going to have you do a task you've never done before, though you heard me describe it. Same stimulus, kind of stimulus, only this time it's going to appear in the center of the screen. And I want you to ignore the color read the word, but don't say anything out loud. I don't want you to read it out loud. I want you to read it in your head, but then if the word is red, and it'll only be red or green, if it's red, I want you to point left, and if it's green, I want you to point right. It doesn't matter what the color is. Look at the word. Do not say that. You don't have to say anything out loud. I don't want to hear anybody, but I want to see fingers pointing to the left if it's red and to the right if it's green. Okay? Easy or hard? Easy. I heard one or two hards, but we'll see what you think afterwards. Very good. One-shot learning, maybe two-shot. Okay? So you did something you've never done before. Most people had the intuition that it was going to be easy. And here's the last task. You're going to do exactly what you just did. If you see the word red, you point left. If you see the word green, you point right. Only now you have to name the color at the same time. Okay? I don't have to ask you whether it's easy or hard. I already hear the grunts. And you're right. Ready? More laughing than pointing, right? Here's the data. And I hesitate to show this in case there are any students in the room, because we try and imbue in our students the importance of doing statistics and careful statistics, especially these days. But you didn't hear me say it. This is a task that didn't, these are data that didn't need statistics. Okay? Those are the real results. This is a study that Ann Menon did as a first-year project when she was in the lab. So along the y-axis is the percent correct, in case you can't read it. These are the three tasks that you just did. The one on the left is color naming and location pointing. And people, this is about, I think, maybe 20 or 30 undergraduates, 200 or 300 trials in each of these conditions. And what you can see is that in the color naming and location pointing, they're pretty good. They're not at 100% accuracy because we placed the constraint in the lab, which I couldn't do here, that they really had to do it simultaneously. So they had to respond within one standard deviation of the slower of the two tasks, meaning that we had to give them enough time to do the slower of the two tasks, meaning slower when it's done on its own, right? But they had to do both within that envelope, so that there was no chance to sort of sequence, sort of thin slice it, as it were, sort of sequence it. And so you can see how they're doing in the color naming location pointing pretty well. They do even better at this test they've never done before, the word pointing. But when you get to having to do both at once, 5% accuracy, right? Absolutely cannot do it. And this is after several hundred trials, not just the 2 or 3 that you did. And in fact, we're now doing this experiment with an imaging component, which I'll maybe mention briefly later. But it takes 1,000 to 10,000 trials. It's Schifrin-Schneider-esque, right? That's how much time it takes to get to do this task. And those are the reaction times, in case you're worried that there's a speed accuracy trade-off. So what's going on here? Well, I've sort of already shown you, but let's just go back and look. Here's the here's the Stroop model, right? And it allows you to color name. You can do it at the same time as location pointing. So now I've added some input for locations and a manual response to point and respond to them. And if you're just naming the color and pointing in the direction of something, there's no crossing of the representations. They're separate. You could do it in parallel, and you showed us that you could. Okay? Now I give you a new task, and you have to name the words, or sorry, look at the words, and then point in a direction. And so if you do it this way, it's no problem. In fact, you can do it pretty quickly because you've got those representations already. But the problem is that if you have to do it at the same time that you're color naming, well, it's exactly as I said in the beginning. You've now opened up this sort of implicit path that causes you trouble. Now, in point of fact, and that's because of the shared representations here, right? Now, in point of fact, you could have done this, right? You could have developed a separate set of representations for mapping the words to the response, but we know you did, or you could have even done this for that matter, right? You could have mapped them onto the representations you have for locations, but we know you didn't do that because if you had, you could have done the task. So your response in this room and in that experiment shows us that there's this strong bias towards relying on these existing representations when you have to learn something new. And that's, as I said, exactly what deep learning has been all about. Okay? But it produces a problem. And so in general, and I'm running out of time here, so I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just want to point out that in general, you can sort of abstract the problem into 2 kinds of representations the system can develop. What I refer to as the minimal basis set, where you have a sort of efficient use of input representations and mapping representations that allows you to accomplish any of the tasks you might want to be able to do, but only one at a time, or a more elaborated representation that we refer to as a tensor product, capturing sort of the pairing of every input modality with every possible output modality for each possible task, which allows you to do as many things at once as you have output modalities, right? You can't put your hand in two places at once. You can't make your mouth say two things at once. But if it involves different output modalities, then with this kind of representation, you can do as many as they will afford, right? But at the cost of developing these elaborate representations, and this takes time. And just to make that point, we've run simulations. Sebastian Muslik did this in the lab, showing that in the case of backprop anyway, backpropagation algorithm, when you train a network up on single tasks, it has a strong bias towards developing this minimal basis set representation. So that's shown in the animation here. The blue line is its performance, and it's very hard to see, I apologize, but the colors are the different sets of representations that develop. You can't see the blue one, but you can see the green and red one, and basically there's just 3 sets of representations. And that's what the minimal basis set is, predicts, right? That you would have the most condensed representation, but constrains you to only do one thing at a time. If you train the system explicitly on multitasking, you can get it to do 3 things at once, and in so doing, it's forced to develop this more elaborated representation, but it only does it after it's sort of gotten the simpler one. So what you'll see here in the animation is that initially, as it's training, it'll split into 3, which is the minimal basis set, and then eventually split out into 9. And again, I apologize, it's not showing so well here, but you can sort of see that there's 9 dots, or there's several dots. And in fact, if you look closely, you'll see there are 9, but only after it's sort of developed the 3. So this shows that there's a bias during training initially to develop compact representations that are multi-purpose, but impose the seriality penalty, okay? And with learning, with a commitment to learning, we can change that and develop fluidity, multitasking, automaticity, right? That's parallel, but it requires learning, okay? So just to summarize, the story I think this tells is that controlled versus automatic processing reflects a fundamental trade-off between shared and separated representations. On the one hand, shared representations are efficiently learned and flexible. Separated ones can take longer to learn, but they're dedicated to particular processes, right? And in particular, shared ones are subject to a seriality constraint, which makes them control dependent. And that's why when we first learn a task, I would argue, we tend to have to do it serially, like when you first learn to drive a car, when you're first learning to play the piano, as the picture showed, or learning to type. But with practice, if it's worth it, then you can develop shared representations that will allow you to execute in parallel and become less control dependent. And so the idea is that the apparent limits in capacity for control reflect a bias towards shared representations in learning, okay, and rational bounds placed on processing as a consequence, because when you're relying on shared representations, you better only be using one set at once. That's what the first half of the talk was meant to say. I've run out of time, so I don't have time to go through all the implications, but I think it does provide a broader framework for thinking about a whole bunch of other psychological factors. I've already argued that it provides us with sort of a normative and, in some sense, quantitative account of the trajectory from controlled to automatic processing that was described by Schifrin and Schneider in the very earliest work, the dynamics of serial versus parallel processing that's been the subject of some very elegant work by Townsend and his colleagues. There are ideas about how if you take account of the persistence of representations and its interaction with shared representations, you can explain things like switch costs and a continuum of serial to parallel processing. This work that an undergraduate working with Sebastian Muslik in the lab has recently submitted to CogSci. I think it provides an account of the binding problem. That is, that serial processing of arbitrary conjunctions reflects the flexibility of the minimal basis set, but its dependence on control. And pop-out reflects the learning that's given to familiar objects, which leads to tensor product-like representations that can be processed in parallel. I also think it frames some questions for a general theory of control. It rationalizes the cost of control in terms of interference risk. And this, in turn, poses sort of an intertemporal choice between getting by and getting trained, right? So how does the system decide this? How can this be formalized? And this is work that's also ongoing in the lab, being pursued by people like Andrew Sachs and Yotam Sagiv, sort of developing a formal theory about the optimization of the choice between relying on control at the cost of seriality versus spending the time to train the system to be able to process in parallel. So I think with that, I will end and simply put up one more time not only the acknowledgement of the people sort of on whose shoulders I've stood and with whom I've worked, but all the people who've actually worked on this project. So thank you. Thank them, and thank you for your attention.